two guest speakers tonight. They're going to talk about the California Condor and the recovery program that they're involved with. Chris West will go first, and he has been involved with the Condor program with the Yurok tribe for about 10 years. He got his master's in wildlife management from HSU, something like that, and he specialized in condor behavior. He's been working with the Condor Conservation Project for 20 years, so he has really learned a lot about condor. He's going to share that with us. And then after him will be Tiana Williams-Claussen, and she is a Yurok tribal member. She grew up in Del Norte County, and she graduated from HSU, and she got her graduate degree at HSU, and she's a Harvard graduate. And she's been working with the Yurok Tribe Wildlife Program since its inception. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Chris. Thanks, Chris.
And I'd like to thank the zoo for having this conservation lecture series for us to be able to participate in, so that the local researchers can actually come and engage the community in this forum. I think that's great. I have been running a little bit long today, so I was trying to cut things down. So I'm going to just jump into it and try and move as quickly as possible to make sure I have plenty of time for Tiana. So I'm going to start out with biology and kind of conservation of the condor. What's so cool about condors? Well, the big thing that people usually think about is how big they are and how few they are. It kind of brings the mystique of the condor to the mind quite a bit. Wingspan of almost 10 feet. They can weigh up to 25 pounds. We don't know how long they live. Unfortunately, anthropogenic or human-caused things usually take them out before they get that old. We do know that closely related species, the Andean condor, has lived to 80 years in captivity, so they do have a pretty long lifespan. They're monomorphic, meaning they look alike. This is a breeding pair here. You can't really tell male from female just by looking at them. They mostly exhibit lifelong monogamy. I like to say they're kind of like people. They date around a little bit. Once they find a mate that they actually do fledge young out of a nest with, that usually kind of solidifies the pair bond, and then they'll be monogamous after that. They only lay one egg every other year, have a long incubation period of almost 2 months. They don't fledge until 6 to 7 months of age, don't reach sexual maturity until 6 to 8 years. And it's this slow reproductive cycle that causes problems for condors. If you put them kind of as a comparison against eagles, for instance, of the large raptor, eagles can have 2 to 3 offspring per year fledge out of a nest. Condors, at one every other year, if you think about like a 10-year span of time, an eagle pair could actually have 20 to 30 offspring fledge from their nest if they're kind of at maximum reproductive potential, while condors could maximize at about 5 chicks out of a nest. So this is where any kind of additional kind of increase in natural mortality rates can quickly lead to population level effects that are noticeable. Condors are also obligate scavengers. They're just big vultures. They're very big and majestic, but just vultures. Here's a couple feeding on a gray whale down in the Big Sur area. They don't take any live prey, only dead things. At one time, the range of the condor extended all the way across what is modern North America. There's evidence of historical breeding all the way up into upstate New York at the top of the Appalachians, all the way down into Florida, and across the southern portion of the United States. By the time of Euro-American arrival to the west coast of what is now North America, you can see that the range had constricted to this kind of brownish tan area, and then very quickly, under the pressures of anthropogenic causes, started to restrict even further, and by the 1950s, we're kind of restricted to this red, what people often refer to as horseshoe shape in central Southern California. I also have in here the release sites that have been used so far in the conservation efforts, and you can see that they're mostly scattered along the very southern edge of the historical range, at least during Euro-American contact. I also bring your attention to right here, what I refer to as the sweet spot. This is kind of where I think you get the most buffer from potentially inhospitable habitat for condors. You also get the advantage of marine resources and I think that this is a very good spot to potentially bring condors. Continuing with the population decline, you can see an estimate of 150 birds around the late 1930s, which quickly declined to the population low of 22 individuals in 1982. And so in the mid-1980s, the decision was driven by high mortalities for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to attempt to bring all the remaining condors into captivity to try and save the species from extinction. So this brings us to Easter Sunday, April 19th, 1987. The last California condor was taken into captivity. And after that, no condors remained in captivity for some time. Luckily for conservationists and researchers, condors actually bred pretty well in captivity. No one really knew how they would do, but they produced eggs within, the first egg within a year of that last condor being taken in. The first egg was laid in captivity, and pretty soon in captivity you had scenes like this. Young condors in nest boxes in captive situations with their parents. And by only the mid-1990s, so only about 8 years or so from when the last bird was taken in, it was deemed that condors were ready to go back into the wild. There had been enough breeding done. As of December of 2017, I don't have newer numbers because this government shutdown prevented the analysis and reporting to be done the last year before. There was 463 condors with 290 in the wild. So, how are these releases doing? Well, total released condors is over 476 at this point. It's right around 476, but like I said, there's only 290 in the wild. So what happened to all the rest of them? There's a big discrepancy between those two numbers. And so this chart here shows you mortality rates at the various release sites. You can see the high here in the Arizona site, the low in Baja. So again, we're talking about a species that is very slow to reproduce. Mortality rates of nearly 60% are not sustainable for a species like this. We're getting better, this being the most recent release site, and so using the most modern techniques available, and so hence there's better survival, but still not really a sustainable mortality rate. So we have to keep working at it. And this slide is from a past coordinator of the Condor Recovery Program, Jesse Grantham. Since most of this mortality is anthropogenic or human caused, we have to wonder, is this conservation effort possible in the face of this huge human footprint that is ever expanding with a species that clearly doesn't get along very well with people? So a big question. So let's go to the number one cause of mortality in condors. I'm just going to touch on this briefly. I'm not going to go through all of the causes of mortality because we have a lot to cover. But I want to at least cover lead. It's pretty controversial. There's a lot going on related to lead and lead ammunition, which is the known source of lead in condors. And that is primarily because when you hunt with lead, lead bullets do what they're designed to do, which is transfer their kinetic energy of moving a fast object, striking an organism, and then mushrooming, fragmenting. That's a way to transmit all of that kinetic energy into a kinetic wave that goes through the animal, kills the animal quickly. That's what hunters are trying to do. They're trying to put down animals quickly and as humanely as possible. So the ammunition is functioning properly, but this type of what people refer to as a snowstorm effect, all these lead fragments that occur, this is in a deer's neck, are potentially lethal pieces. For a condor or an eagle, it only takes about a pinhead-sized piece of lead to be enough to cause mortality from lead toxicosis. Now, some people say, well, condors and eagles aren't dumb. When they eat something, they're not going to eat a piece of metal that's stuck in the meat. But a lot of people haven't seen how condors feed. And when condors feed, they're tearing out chunks of meat, chunks of organ. They're social feeders, so they tend to fight over whatever comes out. And if you can imagine that one of these birds is being careful to not ingest some little bit of lead inside, not so careful. So if you now imagine that snowstorm effect that you saw was in that organ, I have watched this video a lot. 7 different birds get pieces of that organ. So a highly contaminated piece of organ or meat that is consumed in such a way could kill 7 birds at one time. So, moving on with lead, of wild condors tested, 48% tend to have elevated lead, about 40%. But biannual testing only captures about 10% of exposures. We only capture birds twice a year. Lead's only in their system for about 2 weeks. So there's a huge portion of the year where they're not being tested. And what we found from feather analysis, where you can actually get a 2-month window of time, cut a strip of feather and then test it all the way along, birds are getting exposed every 1 to 2 months at levels that could potentially be lethal. So we're really not getting at it that well. We know that lead toxicosis is responsible for 26% of juvenile condor deaths and about 67% of adult condor deaths. Reason for that is juvenile birds tend to stay a little bit closer to release sites. They're getting proffered food that the conservation groups are putting out, so they're getting a little bit cleaner source. Older birds, as they get older, more mature, expand their ranges, tend to encounter wild carcasses, tainted carcasses much more frequently. So what's the solution? Well, transition from lead to non-lead. There are non-lead ammunition types out there that work just as effectively at lead. They do what is called controlled expansion, where they mushroom open, don't fragment, and are made of less toxic materials like copper. We can also try and provide clean food, treat birds with toxicosis. Like I said, even trapping twice a year, you're only getting a small percentage of exposures. And I think most importantly, engage with the hunting community. Instead of having them feel like they're being singled out and having fingers pointed at them as the problem, make them part of the solution. And we've been working hard with our Hunters as Stewards program to try and do that. Okay, so what about the Pacific Northwest? Well, this is a local artist's vision of what condor recovery could look like in the Pacific Northwest. This is an image by Gary Bloomfield. Some of you probably are familiar with Gary's work. And this is what we hope, this is what we can kind of hold in our hearts when we hit those stumbling blocks as we're trying to move forward through this process. Tiana and I have hit a lot of stumbling blocks in the last decade working on this. So how do things look so far with the 10 years of work that we have engaged in? Well, we've done a lot of habitat analysis using remote sensing as well as on-the-ground measurements to look at what things look like in Northern California and this potential northern range. And it seems like there's quite a bit of high-quality condor habitat out there. We've also looked at contaminants and surrogate species, ravens and turkey vultures, looking at lead and other contaminants, and we found that they're relatively low. That's great news for turkey vultures. You can see Tiana and I are pretty excited about it in this picture here. So that's a good thing also. Also, we've looked at contaminants in marine mammals. There's expectation that condors will be using marine mammals as a food source, and there's potentially issues with that. We have found that the most contaminated areas where a lot of the contamination events have occurred in the past, in Southern California, you see kind of a descending trend as you look at marine mammals up and down the California, Oregon, Washington coast, and we are many magnitudes lower than where some problems have been shown in the Big Sur area. So we're pretty hopeful that that's not going to be an issue. So where do we go from here? Well, we're working with regulatory processes with the federal government and state government. We're trying to get a signature from the Secretary of Interior. Some of you may know there's been a little bit of turnover in Washington. And there's been a lot of people out of work that are helping us with this process, so it's hard to get things done. So we have hope, but we have established or found a preferred release site and a base of operations. We're working on treatment agreements with various zoo partners, including Sequoia Park Zoo, who has been working very hard with us on this process. And of course, we're still looking for funding. I don't think that Tiana and I will ever stop looking for funding, considering we need about $500,000 a year for the next 20 years. So we will continue in those pursuits. The operations center that I mentioned is going to be situated in Oric, California. Another big partner on this project is Redwood National Park, and they have some old office area out in this area. If I zoom in, you can see these rather dilapidated buildings, most of which have been demolished, but we're in the process of renovating this structure right here. And we're calling that our CMOC, Condor Management Operations Center. It'll have office space, storage space, it'll have a walk-in freezer for keeping dairy calf carcasses, vehicle and quad storage, a workshop area, and potentially a bunk area for our intern crews that will be running our day-to-day operations in the field. And as I mentioned, Sequoia Park Zoo, an ever important partner, has been working with us on the treatment side of things. We need a condor treatment area and veterinary support. Without something local, we're driving to the Oregon Zoo in Portland or to the Oakland Zoo down in the Bay Area. So obviously we're within an hour and a half of our potential release site here. So critical piece. This is a quarantine treatment pen in Los Angeles. All of these birds have lead toxicosis and are all being treated. This is from one trapping event, so you can get quite sizable numbers. And through the magic of time travel and artist renditions, we can see what a facility here at the zoo might look like, tucked away. It's not going to be open for public viewing. These are going to be sick birds, and so the stress of being on display will be too much for them. But we really value the conservation partnership that the Sequoia Park Zoo has offered us. Another thing we need is a release management facility. This is what you have in fields to manage condors. So this is pretty much just 3 boxes. You've got a flight pen, you've got, it's an unfortunate name, but it came about before we knew that DDT was a problem in marine mammals for condors. This actually stands for double door trap. We don't dose them in here. And then we have an observation blind so we can watch the birds. And the double door trap allows us to have remote functioning doors. We can bait this and allow birds in, and then close the outer door and then open this door to let them into the flight pen, or vice versa. We can have birds in here, have this door open, wait for the assemblage of birds that we want to be in the trap, close this door, and then they're staged to be released into the exterior. This was developed by Joe Burnett with Ventana Wildlife Society, actually while I was first working with them in 1999, and it has really changed how condors are managed in the field. So just some examples of what these structures look like. This is pinnacles, here's your flight pen, here's your observation area. These are mock power poles. They're shock wired so that the birds, if they land on them, they get a little bit of a jolt, and they quickly learn to not go near power lines or power poles. And then this is the double door trap down here on the side. Another version, this is in Big Sur. So you've got your flight pen, double door trap, your observation area. This is this is Bitter Creek in Southern California. So we're actually standing inside the flight pen. They have an internal double door trap, and then the observation area is in the back. And then this one here is a modular version that the Ventana Wildlife Society is using down in San Simeon, which we are probably going to use a model similar to this. They're just panels that can be bolted together. These are made as temporary housing or used as temporary housing for zoo animals, so they can withstand a rhino or whatever inside. So, so you can configure them however you like. They're cost effective. The double door trap here in this configuration is on the end with the observation area over here, and they'll be really great for our application. We have a lot of bears, so not only will they keep condors in, but they'll keep bears and other predators out, and they're lockable, and they can withstand fire and all of that, so a really great option. Again, pioneered by Joe Burnett at Ventana Wildlife Society. So we'll talk a little bit about management. Our cohorts or groups of birds that we're targeting is about 6 birds per each release, so about 6 per year. Birds will be socialized first in the captive setting in the zoos. so that all they have to do is worry about learning how to fly. They'll know how to interact with other condors, how to find their place at a carcass to feed, do all that, and they just have to worry about figuring that whole flight thing out. We'll keep them in the field site in that pen for a few months to get them acclimatized to the area. They can watch other birds flying, see what the wind currents are like, get used to the conditions prior to release. And we'll probably bring mentors from zoos also. Birds that are unreleasable because they have injuries or something like that, but have valuable condor social skills that they can impart on these young birds. All the birds will have tags and transmitters, vinyl wing tags. They'll all have satellite transmitters, so we'll be able to get real-time information right on our desktops at work about where the birds are and what they're doing. And then they'll also have radio transmitters in case we need to actually go and get hands or eyes on a bird. Alphanumeric tags, like I mentioned. And the satellite tags will allow kind of analysis of where they're going, what kind of resources they're using, and the radio tags will also have a mortality setting. So if the tag doesn't move for a little while, we know that there's a bird potentially in trouble or dead. We can go out, we can find it, and hopefully save the bird, or at least recover it and find out what went wrong. So we'll be watching the birds while they're in the field pens, making sure they're socializing, using roosts in good condition, and then, like I said, we can get the birds that we want for release. If there's, say, 2 birds, we go, oh, these are the best ones, where they seem really on top of things. We'll wait for those 2 to get into the double door trap them in there, and then hopefully release those birds into a previous or an already occurring feeding event with local turkey vultures. So what this might look like, you can see here, so we'll have an electrified perimeter fence protecting the site. And then this is our setup. We've got some birds still in the flight pen and 2 are ready to go. So we go ahead and throw out something for the condors to snack on. And then that brings in the local turkey vultures and start feeding. And then we can open the double door trap and let the condors out and into the to socialize with their friends, the turkey vultures. And what this might actually look like in real life is, imagine that the condor is inside the pen and these guys are feeding. We open the door, the condor comes out to socialize with his turkey vulture friends. And it engages with them socially. And just for the sake of gratuitous violence, we'll see that again. And you can see this raven is really excited about the whole situation. And then this guy just has to come over anyway.
And laugh.
So, and I didn't run it further, but this guy actually just showed how tough they were. They walked right over and started feeding right opposite that condor immediately after that. I think he kind of had to save face a little bit. Anyway, subsequent releases, once we have condors out, we'll do the same kind of a thing, but we'll try and get condors to come back and get on the ground feeding prior to the next bird or 2 kind of released at a time out into feeding situations as well. So that's kind of the plan there. We're also going to be doing biannual trapping, spring and fall, where we can do physical checks. You see Dr. Silver here from the zoo. At one of the trapping events, here's Kent, one of our other biologists, looking at transmitters and doing maintenance work. It also gives us an opportunity to draw blood, and as you're seeing from this, some of us and folks from the zoo here participating in these events. It's a great training opportunity, and we've been doing a lot of work over the last several years related to this. Here's Tiana working with folks at the Oregon Zoo. And Ruth and Lindsay from the Sequoia Park Zoo here, some of the keepers here, up getting a bird ready for transfer to a field release site at the Oregon Zoo. And it's really important to learn how to do this kind of stuff. These are large, powerful animals. If you don't know how to handle them well, if you don't practice handling them well, it's dangerous for the keepers and the field staff. It's dangerous for the bird itself. So you really get a sense looking at the size of a bird next to people letting it go, how big they are, and their strength matches that, and they can definitely cause damage to people. So training is critical. So long-term vision. We believe that lower human population in the Pacific Northwest will reduce human-condor conflict. We're looking to release 60 birds over about a 20-year period of time. And we're hoping that Northern California is the next phase of condor recovery, representing a gateway to the Pacific Northwest as a whole. Ultimate goal, I left the cursor right on there, is birds without tags. Getting to the point where we don't have to be monitoring them anymore. We can let them just go out and be wild condors without being messed with by us. So, that is the end of my presentation. This is some
I'm Tiana Williams-Claussen. I'm a Yurok tribe member and a Yurok tribe biologist. Both Chris and I have been here since the beginning in 2008. Chris gave a wonderful explanation of what we've been up to and what we will be doing, and I will be giving an explanation of why it's so important to the Yurok tribe that Kupreganish ki Keme, that the California condor should return home to Yurok country. And so our goal is primarily driven by our cultural connection to the Preganish. In Yurok belief, Condor is Poitwasan, or kind of the boss. He's like the head of the spiritual realm, or one of them, in Yurok cosmology. In the words of one of our former councilmen and cultural leader, it can soar the highest, so we figured that was the one to get our prayers to heaven when we are asking for the world to be in balance. Some families, many families like my own, teach that they're never to be harmed because of their great sacredness, and any feathers which we use in our regalia are considered to be gifts from the birds. This is a picture by a local artist in Riesling, and she's absolutely amazing. It depicts our two highest ceremonies, the white deerskin dance and the jump dance, and they're both world renewal ceremonies. And these tie very closely to the condor, and they actually tie to our relationship, which goes all the way back to the beginning of time in our stories, when we were first establishing these first world renewal ceremonies. And at that time, before humans were really even on the scene, and the spirits of the world, the animals were the people of the world, the Creator came and said, we need to establish these ceremonies to keep our world renewed and balanced. This is the most important thing that we will have to do for the rest of eternity, basically. And so he says to everybody, I need a song, or in other words, a prayer that will help guide these dances. And I've heard this story told two ways. On the one hand, some people say everybody jumped in and tried to give their best and their brightest, super trying to impress the Creator so that their song would be chosen. The other way I've heard it told is nobody made a peep because holy cow, that's freaking huge. But in either case, Condor does not step forward because condors are not exactly songbirds. They're not known for their songs. They actually don't have a voice box, so when they use their voices, it's really hisses and grunts. But Creator saw Condor's heart, and he saw how strong and powerful it was and how much he could contribute. So he says, no, I want to hear your song. In obedience, Condor sings, and it's hisses and it's grunts, and it's a song that only a mother could love. But because of the power and the purity of his spirit, it became the most beautiful song that's ever been heard, the most powerful, and it was a song that was given to us and that we continue to sing in these ceremonies to this day. So you can see that Condor is very integral to the jump dance and the white deerskin dance, which are our world renewal ceremonies. They're our highest ceremonies. They're actually what we consider to be our reason for being on this earth. Condors also provide their feathers. We use their feathers in the regalia for these dances. According to not only Yurok, but many of the tribes in this region, so many of us have world renewal ceremonies, Hupa, Karu, Kuyat, Palo as well. But we believe that they imbue their spirit when they give a feather that we use then in our regalia. And you can see why that would be so important with such a powerful spirit, not only because of the power of the spirit, but I mean, condors really epitomize going across the landscape and cleaning it up. I mean, that makes sense. And so they're contributing their spirit, they're singing and praying along with us when we conduct our dances. So all of this has led to the Yurok decision to try to recover condors to Yurok ancestral territory. I'm not going to say the decision was made, but the guidance was given by this group of people, Tribal Park Task Force, which were Yurok elders and other knowledgeables who were particularly chosen because of their cultural knowledge and their knowledge of natural resources in the region. And they determined that Griganish, the California condor, was the single most important terrestrial species for the Yurok people to bring back, primarily for the cultural reason, but for ecological reasons as well. And so that was all the way back in 2003. The self-governance director at the time, Tom Gates, then started looking for funding, and we received funding in 2008 from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which got us on this path. Our elders are, of course, guiding our actions. They are helping to, this is our Yurok Constitution, which is based on tribal values, basically, and our elders are helping us figure out how we want to meet our Yurok Constitution. There are two that are particularly important to condor reintroduction, which is to preserve and promote our culture, language, and religious beliefs and practices for our children in perpetuity, and then to restore and enhance the tribal fisheries, water rights, tribal forests, and all other natural resources, which of course includes our wildlife as well. And what we're really going for here, here's another beautiful piece of art by Gary Bloomfield. It was actually funded by the Sequoia Park Zoo Conservation Fund. We're working on getting them a poster so that it can be handed out to you particularly. But you can see that condor is very central to our world. Everybody has a role, but condor is central to our world. So you can see why we'd be very impacted by the fact that they haven't been here in actually about 100 years. You can see us up in the corner there. Oops. Uh-oh. There we go. So at this point, I'm actually going to make a transition. I've been speaking from the broader Yurok perspective, why it's important that we bring condors back. I'm actually going to step back and speak from my personal perspective as a Yurok tribe biologist and as a Yurok tribe woman, why it's so important for me to be working to bring condors back. And I think it's one of the things that has always struck me is the parallel between condor story and our story in a lot of ways. We both came to the near brink of destruction. There's a very deliberate effort to take out not only Yurok people, but all the peoples around here. There was potentially a less deliberate effort for condors, where there were condor takings. There's people taking eggs as well and things like that. There's a lot of people who said that condors just aren't a part of this world anymore. We should just let them go. And I still hear that about being Yurok, you know. So, did you show that? I can't remember. Chris, this is a picture from Joseph Brandt, who works down at the Fish and Wildlife Service down at the Southern California site. And there's actually 22 birds in this picture, which on the one hand is an amazing testimony to their recovery. On the other, this is as many birds as there were at one point in the entire world. It's very impactful when I think about that. And you think about how closely they came to just absolute extirpation, except for the love of people who just had to save them. They did all this amazing work to save them. In the same way, we came to the brink of destruction, but through the commitment of our tribal people, we're working on restoring ourselves, and if I may say so myself, we're doing some pretty amazing things along the way. One story that is particularly poignant and relevant, I think, to California condor is the story of our white deerskin dance, which we almost lost entirely. And again, remember, this is one of our reasons for being, these world renewal dances. But it had been generations since it had been danced, for various reasons, one of them being it was illegal to practice tribal religion for a long time. But our tribal elders and cultural leaders came to the point of, we have to restore this dance if we're going to persist as Yurok people. And so Awak Glenmore, and I say Awak because that means he's no longer with us, one of the eldest of our elders was a primary leader in reinstituting the white deerskin dance after many years, having been one of the only surviving elders at that time to have actually participated in a dance in his youth. Oops. And I remember, and the story was told to us by one of the cultural leaders, that one of the first things he said is, so I'm going to start with the Condor song, because that's the most important thing. And that same leader, who was so disassociated from the dance because he'd never experienced it, is like, I didn't even know how important condors were. And so I think about how close we came to absolutely losing this, because of course we lost Glenn just a few years after that. What if we hadn't taken that step? What if we hadn't pushed? What if it hadn't been for the people So I'm extremely grateful to him and to everybody else who contributed to this. I'm extremely grateful to the Condor Recovery Program for the same amount of passion in bringing condors back from the brink of extinction. I'm also going to touch on local stories. This was the story given to me by Cheryl Seidner. I'm not going to tell it as well as she did because she just spoke so eloquently and beautifully of the trauma and the tragedy and the ultimate triumph of the Wiyot people in the face of a lot of adversity. But they also have very close ties to the Condor. They also have their world renewal ceremony. They also use Condor in the regalia for those dances. And of course, most people are very familiar with the tragedy of Indian Island, which actually was a massacre that occurred during their world renewal ceremony. The men were away, the women and children and elders were camped, sleeping, and a group of Humboldt County denizens, thinking they were doing a good thing, went over and killed as many of them as they could. In and of itself is incredibly tragic. It's particularly tragic from the tribal perspective because these were the elders. These are the people who hold who you are in their hearts and their minds, and they lost so many of them. And that was back in 1860. So ultimately, though, it got to the point where something had to change because there's this huge wound that the Wiyot people are carrying. It was prompted in Cheryl's story by a replica, I believe it's a replica Columbus ship coming into the Eureka Harbor. And she's like, really? You guys are gonna celebrate this guy who pretty much epitomized like rape and enslavement and murder and everything bad that's happened to my people. You're gonna bring him into our country and celebrate him? I don't think so. So they actually started, well, there's protests, and they actually started a Candlelight Vigil to help bring remembrance to the Wiyot massacre and make it a part of the larger community narrative. And it started out small, went year by year, it got bigger and bigger until people from all aspects of the community were becoming involved. And eventually it got to the point where Cheryl and family and friends were like, we need to take that final step. We need to heal ourselves of that massacre by actually holding the world renewal dance again. And they had a lot of problems going in because on the one hand, like I said, they lost all their elders. That doesn't mean they'd lost all their knowledge, but they had to do some searching. And they actually reached out to other tribes who hold world renewal ceremonies to help bring that knowledge back as well. They'd also lost their regalia. It had been given to a friend and somewhere disappeared along the line. So again, they had to borrow those regalia pieces until they could make their own again. And again, the Yurok tribe, the Butt tribe, others helped contribute to that. So I love that community investment from a larger perspective as well. And of course, ultimately, they were successful. This is an image of some men going over to the dance for that first time, for that first year. And I just can't imagine the intensity of feeling that they've got being a part of that renewal. So this is actually a picture of the last Candlelight Vigil. As Cheryl told me, there was actually some community members who were upset that they weren't going to hold the vigil anymore because it had become such a community event and so many people had become invested in it. And I can't describe it as well as she did, but she's like, it was time. We had had our grief. We had had our healing. And as I'm listening to her, I get this sense that this long grieving period had allowed the Wiyot people to kind of heal from within. It wasn't just a thin scab over the top. They were really whole again. And it was time. You still have the scar, you'll still remember, but it's not something you need to dwell on in perpetuity because now we're whole again as a tribe. So now these dances, our white deerskin dance, their world renewal ceremony, are healing the world again. And myself as a Yurok person, I can't help but think that these prayers aren't contributing to our restoration. I mean, just looking from the Yurok perspective, we've got dam removal, we've got condors coming back, we've got language revitalization, our kids are doing better in school, all kinds of things. And I think that our prayers have a lot to do with it. And I'm hoping that our prayers are also, people might consider them a benefit to our world, just up here on the North Coast in general. But of course, the next step is to actually get condors back here in our skies, in our redwoods, so that we can engage with them in the way that the Creator had intended in the first place, one-on-one relationship. And that's what we're about at the Yurok tribe, not only for ourselves, but for all the peoples who live on the North Coast. So I hope you can understand from my presentation so far that we're really undergoing a cultural renaissance here. We're really rebuilding ourselves from the ground up, and Condor is a really huge part of that. Condor restoration, in my opinion, is actually an expression of Yurok sovereignty and of our expanding management capacity, because of course we used to be caretakers over our whole region, our whole Yurok Yurok ancestral territory until that was taken away from us. We still have that knowledge, we still have that capacity, and I feel like we're taking it back. It's particularly awesome because we're doing this in partnership with our neighbors, particularly with great partners like the Sequoia Park Zoo and the National Park Service like that. We're bringing together people from all walks of life and conservation backgrounds, the hunters for example, to create a model just for cooperation and commitment and recovery that I think is rarely seen, but is really awesome in this region. And I'm just really, I'm really privileged to be a part of this because my elders prayed for me. For those elders who gave their whole life, for those elders who still pray for me. For my baby girl, who's 8.5 months old now. And it's gonna be the first generation Yurok to have condors in her sky in 100 years. I'm incredibly proud to be a part of that. Sorry, it's been a while since I gave this talk, so I do want to say again, it's all in partnership. We have so many friends here. This is just a small snapshot of the people who have been helping us out. We literally can't fit people on here anymore, so we're kind of maxed out. I do want to thank you all. We do have a question period afterwards, is my understanding, but if afterwards you have questions you'd like to ask, you can reach us either at these numbers or just call the Yurok Tribe main office, or we have a website you can visit, or just search Yurok Tribe Wildlife Program and you'll find us pretty quick. Thank you.
So when those 3 ladies released that huge bird, have they ever turned back onto the released people?
I'm sure it's happened. I haven't seen, although, well, when we were up at the Oregon Zoo recently, we had done some work with some birds, and we were letting them go into a larger pen where they would spend a little bit of time before they were taken out to the field release sites. And one of them just didn't want to go, and actually jumped over the carrier and attacked the keeper.
Oh.
And, she managed to get a foot on it and hold it back, though. Someone got a broom and got it in. Yeah, they're pretty aggressive. I mean, typically, if there's an escape route, that's what they'll take. They're not just going to land and attack somebody. But if they feel threatened, they definitely defend themselves.
You had a slide that said that lower population in the Northwest is going to decrease human condor interaction. Is that true that there is lower population decreasing?
Well, no, not lowering, but lower population than, for instance, Southern California, where they're trying to recover.
Okay. You're
birds.
comparing it to
Yes,
different
yes.
areas. Okay.
And we've actually, there's been some analyses done of projected population growth all the way up into, 2100. Massive expansion of urbanized areas in Southern California, and the authors of the study that I was looking at said they didn't look at areas north of Sacramento because there wasn't going to be considerable enough growth to consider it for their analysis. Perfect. It's good for me, good for the condors. Gentleman in the back.
One of the beauties of the restoration of their, I think speaking as a non-Indian, of their restoration of their ceremonies on the island was their invitation to the community to participate. Is there anything parallel with the Condor restoration where there's fundraising or opportunities for the community to help and be part of it?
From the Condor perspective, we have a lot of people want to volunteer, and we haven't really had a whole lot for people to do, especially recently since we're doing mostly boring regulatory meetings and things like that. We do anticipate, as I mentioned, the birds are going to have transmitters on them and radio transmitters as well as satellite transmitters. We will have intern crews, but we do envision a time when there's going to be enough birds out there that we look at the GPS hits and we say, oh, look, there's something going on over by Garberville or something out in the Trinities, and there's a bunch of birds. We can see that there's a bunch of satellite hits. What are they doing? What are they getting into? Is there a resource there that's important? Is it, as one of the other sites sent people out and they found a pile of ground squirrels that had been shot and piled up as kind of for a trophy picture, and it contaminated like 10 condors, you know, so you can see something like that and you can send people out, here's a GPS, we already have a database built where we know land ownership for something like the closest 20-something counties that we had a little bit of money that came through the parks, and they put together this database for us, so we can look, this is the landowner, this is how we contact them, we can contact them, can we access your land and see what's going on, and we're hoping to have a fleet of volunteers where we can say, here's a GPS unit, go find out what's happening at this location. That's going to be incredibly important information, and I imagine at some point it's going to be so wide-ranging that it's going to be difficult for us to keep up with that. So volunteers will be critical for
I'm
that.
not just talking about volunteering, though, I'm talking about, probably $500,000 a year budget you were talking about.
Oh, well, we do have a little condor-shaped donate now button on our webpage. Anyone is welcome to click that, and you can donate money through PayPal. I have even had one person who continues to follow our project walked up to us at Godwood Days and said, here's $300, it's what I can afford, take it and do stuff with it. So, you know, we'll take it however we can get it. If the community wants to be involved, if individuals want to be involved, if anyone here knows anyone at large foundations, has any ins with anyone, please come and contact us. Yeah, we're trying to diversify our funding base. Most of it's been government grants up to this point. You can't run a 20-year conservation project on government grants. It's just not feasible, so we need to diversify.
I have a friend who mentioned that she thought she had heard that the ESA had become one of the obstacles that you guys are dealing with. Endangered Species Act.
Well, there's always hurdles related to regulatory need. So under the ESA, there are protections. I guess the biggest obstacle is that there are land managers out there that are concerned about the ESA and bringing an endangered species up and releasing it here. You can imagine if you were a company making money off timber, and all of a sudden you may have a bunch of endangered species roosting in your trees to harass, harm, take, includes you drive a truck up and the condor takes off out of a tree. You've just violated the Endangered Species Act. So we are working on a 10J experimental non-essential designation for the population, which essentially means that it relaxes protections under the Endangered Species Act. You can say, okay, these are the things we want to keep under this designation. If someone goes and shoots a condor, they're violating the Endangered Species Act. If a timber company is following best forest practice rules and spooks a condor out of a tree, they will not be hit with the Endangered Species Act. And it allows people like Pacific Gas and Electric, Pacific Power, Green Diamond Resource Company to all come and sign on board to our conservation agreements, which they have. So I think that working collaboratively with those groups, using those tools under the ESA has helped kind of alleviate some of those pressures. If we can just get the Secretary of the Interior signature on it.
You said that part of what you're doing with the condors that you're getting ready to release is you have mock-ups of power lines,
Power poles.
power poles with the electricity on it.
Mhm.
How long does it take for them to realize that this is dangerous, I'm gonna stay away from it?
I've seen birds in a zoo that have never been exposed to one land on it 3 times in a row and get shot and then kind of not go back to it. I also have talked to staff that have said they've seen subordinate birds seen a dominant individual. There's a very strong hierarchy in condor world. They see a dominant bird get shot and they just go, wow, that wasn't good. And they never land on it. So they definitely follow what their elders and dominant individuals do and how they respond to things.
And it's my understanding that since they've instituted it, there hasn't been that sort of power like that.
So those that are in the wild are staying away from power lines.
It was kind of a there was a lot of collisions initially, and now that the birds aren't looking to land on the lines, they just don't go that close to them. There's one line that was a major problem in the Big Sur area where it went right down a ridge close to the Condor release site, right at the top of the ridge, and so there was a lot of mid-span collisions on that line. 3 condors died, and before PG&E finally said, okay, we're going to voluntarily bury that line. It cost them about $3 million to do it, but they did it. They buried the entire power line from that radar site all the way down to the coast. So PG&E has been pretty good at working with people. I did have on the release site slide, I mentioned PG&E.
Yes.
I know they're not very popular right now for various reasons. Luckily, before they declared bankruptcy, they gave us money to build our field release site. So they have been active for quite a while in condor conservation because there's a lot of potential impacts that can be caused by their infrastructure. And so I think they learned early on that it's better for them to take the proactive road and use that as advertisement rather than fight against it. And so we've been working pretty closely with PG&E.
And I've been working with some of their particular individuals, and they're legitimately passionate about making a difference. So it's a good partnership.
On a related topic, what about wind farms?
There's a lot of interest in wind farms locally, and we've been engaging in conversations. We haven't gotten too far in those conversations. The one that's trying to put up a farm in the Scotia area actually run a wind farm down in Southern California, and they have been kind of leading the way in kind of pioneering geofencing.
I think that's what they call it.
Geofencing. So essentially they've got a series of receivers. So when condors or an area demarked, so when the condor satellite transmitters beam information to the system that takes in the data, it automatically notifies them if they're within this imaginary line. It alerts their staff to then start paying attention to that individual, and if they move within a certain other imaginary line, even closer to the wind farm, they have a full shutdown on that portion of the grid. They have been supplying the Southern California release site with all of their transmitters for several years now. Those are about $4,000 a piece. So each bird down there being supplied by that company, as well as all the subscriptions for the data plans and all of that. They have made similar offers to us, but we're very early in kind of our discussions with them and how effective it would be, and kind of the pros and cons of all of that. But a lot of these companies are getting a lot more proactive about trying to work with these, and that's all well and good that a condor with a transmitter on it can shut down a wind farm. But like I said, we also want to get to the point where we have birds with nothing mounted to them. How does that help condors in the future, and what are those risks? And those are the things that we have to weigh as we move into these discussions.
Yeah, because I was just thinking golden eagles don't have that protection now.
Yeah,
So.
exactly.
Yeah, I saw these, there you've got 2 transmitters or whatever, but you had a picture with just one, and I don't know how much they weigh, but how are they at balancing their flight?
Compared to the weight of a condor, they don't weigh very much. And it used to be that we had a radio transmitter on one wing and a satellite transmitter on the other wing, and often a redundant radio transmitter mounted to a tail feather. Now they've kind of just gone to one wing at a time. They do a satellite on one wing and a radio on the tail. And the reason for that is these things, they're pierced through the wing itself. They do cause tissue damage, and they can, what they refer to as blow out, where they can tear out. And then you have to let the wing rest for a certain amount of time for it to heal, so you can then move the transmitter to the other wing. You don't want to have 2 wings unusable. And there have been situations where both holes on both wings have been stretched to the point where you can't mount a transmitter or tag. Typically, when they do their biannual trap-ups, they'll take an individual like that, take it to the zoo, do a little plastic surgery, repair on the wing, let it heal for a certain amount of time, and then they'll be able to take another transmitter. It's unfortunate that the birds have to go through all this, but for the sake of learning about what's happening with the birds, it's extremely important. I said there was a time when it was deemed that they could start reintroducing birds because there was enough. When they started reintroducing birds, they still didn't know why the birds had died in the first place. And part of it was, there was developers saying, we want to start developing these areas because there's no condors there. You say there's condor protections, but there's no condors occupying the area. We want to put it in development. They had to get birds back out to maintain protection over areas that were critical, but also kind of as sacrificial lambs. Let's see what happens. Let's rig these birds up with transmitters and find out why they're dying so we can try and fix the issue. And so I don't think we're out of the woods yet, especially in a site like this where there could be risks out there that we don't know about. Maybe they don't exist at other sites. We have to pay very close attention to the birds that we release and make sure that we understand what's going on if we start to lose them. Oh boy, it seems like there's more and more hands going on.
With all the increase in technology, is there any work being done on getting these transmitters to be smaller?
Oh yes. And the Condor program actually gets pretty good deals from the manufacturers because they're kind of one of the test cases for newer and newer technology and getting them smaller and smaller and smaller. And so, yeah, there's a lot going on with that.
Yeah, I know we have an Eagle cam. Is there a Condor cam?
There are Condor cams. I'm not sure the website for the one down in Southern California with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but they have a cam often running. There are Condor cams through the Ventana Wildlife Society's webpage, and they usually have them at the release site. If there's a nest going on that they can access easily, they'll put them in nests. I know U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has had them in nests in Southern California, so you can actually watch the chick in the nest and the parents go in and interact with them.
That's pretty cute.
And we will definitely be, we're looking to get funding to do all of that. Well, we're intending to have a camera at our release site, so we'll be able to see birds in the pen. We'll be hoping to web stream that. As nests come along, that's gonna be further down the line. We hope to get cameras into nests. We also have been having some discussions, we're not sure yet, but if we can't have treatment areas here at the zoo open to the public to see, it would be great to be able to have cameras in place for people to be able to see what's going on with the treatment and the birds that are in need of treatment, undergoing treatment. And the purple.
Separating the spiritual issues, if we can, and I know that's difficult, and the karma of taking care of the planet and all that. But I'm sure people have asked you, like, maybe some things, just are not meant to survive. And there are the polar bears won't have enough ice, and what are we gonna do with them? Like right now, they're running amok on some island in Russia with people living on, right? You probably heard that, there's like 50 of them, right? In people's houses. And maybe, we're adaptable. Earth adapts, some things die, some things will come about, maybe we'll have a
Let's
new-
move the people.
So how do you respond? How do you respond? I'm sure you've heard that, because you're spending a huge amount of effort on, let's say, 60 birds. The amount of money, the technology, the care, the land, the science, the praying, why not?
Have you felt anything in your heart from what she said?
No, I'm saying separate, I'm talking about separating the spiritual issues.
It's
It's
a
a
legitimate question. It's one that we get.
Yes, I'm wondering, how do you respond to that?
I think that definitely evolution, which I believe firmly in, there become evolutionary dead ends and species go extinct. Lineages end. Heck, I'm almost 50 and I have my kids, I'm a dead end myself. And maybe that's okay. But I think that there's cases where when we can look at the causes and suss out what the causes are of the pressures on specific species, and they're anthropogenic in nature, and they're solvable, I think that we should put the effort out to do that. I think that along those lines, the more challenging question I get is from people that are working with less charismatic species, that say, for the amount of money that they put into the Condor program last year, I could save the species I'm working on. Why doesn't the money go to that? And that is a harder one for me to answer, and that's a challenging situation. I think, though, with these charismatic species that often do take large amounts of funding to try and preserve, you can get public engagement. You can fill a room here full of people that are interested to come and hear about condors, where if it was some kind of little midge fly in a salt marsh, maybe no one would show up. But maybe that kind of energizing of the public can change laws, can change spending of places like the Sequoia Park Zoo, which is, they're not bringing condors here to increase their viewership to the public. They're not going to get anything from viewership because of it. They're doing it because there's a transition in the mission of places like the Sequoia Park Zoo and other zoos that are seeing that there is a value to conservation above and beyond the bottom line, and above and beyond what the public can experience, but we can be part of and engage with the public on. And I think that changing the kind of that vision of what conservation is important, and using charismatic species when possible to help that shift along is important.
I got one more question.
The idea of economic feasibility and stuff, of preserving things, the world is going to keep on evolving. It's done pretty happily getting us to where the point we are now. If we mess these things up, it's going to keep on evolving, but there's no guarantee that what evolves is going to be of any benefit to us whatsoever.
Well, let's give them another